Well, today we're going to talk about the Oldsmobile Starfire, and specifically the 1963 Oldsmobile Starfire. But first, let's give a little bit of history with respect to this nameplate. Now, the Starfire name was first used by Oldsmobile on a 1953 Motorama car, and it was named after the Lockheed F-94 Starfire jet fighter. Remember, this, of course, was the time during which automakers were enamored with aircraft and rockets and all of those things, so it seemed apt to name a car after a Lockheed aircraft. After all, Cadillac had kind of stolen the idea for its tail fins back in 1948 from a Lockheed aircraft as well. It's perhaps that Lockheed aircraft, the P-38 Lightning, which you see here. You can obviously also see the inspiration behind the Cadillac tail fins from 1948. That perhaps was the most seminal aircraft in all of automotive history because of what it created, a vertical lamp signature that continues to this day on Cadillacs. But I digress. Let's get back to the Oldsmobile Starfire. As I said, it first appeared on this 1953 Motorama car, this kind of bubbly, round, pudgy, doughy, fishy-faced, I guess, Oldsmobile. And this was during a time frame when General Motors was presenting a lot of concepts at the Motorama shows, and that included the Chevrolet Corvette and the Pontiac Bonneville. Now, the Oldsmobile was the only one that was a four-place vehicle. So obviously the Corvette and the Bonneville concept at the time were just two-passenger vehicles. Oldsmobile went in a different direction with its Starfire and had this four-passenger drop top. Now, this particular concept was really aligned with Harley Earl's styling philosophy, which was significant amounts of chrome. Take a look at that huge guppy-faced front bumper that is surrounding the grille and spilling over to the sides. Very heavy-handed, very Harley Earl. I will say that the body sides have maybe a bit less chrome than what one might be used to for a Harley Earl design, but I certainly wouldn't say that it's devoid of chrome, particularly with that molding that runs from the check in the belt downward, kind of passing over the rear wheel and then going to incorporate itself with the rear bumper. But other than that, this is a really kind of a clean car. It has some Ferrari-esque tones to it, too. I would say up front with that egg crate grille and the particular shape of the grille and the forms on the fenders. I do like how the fenders extend into a cone that surrounds the headlamp behind this see-through transparent cone that covers the headlights as well. Now, the engine in that 1953 Motorama car was a 303 cubic inch, I should say 303.7 cubic inch, Oldsmobile Rocket V8 engine. And the Rocket V8 had been introduced in 1949, so it was still relatively new at that time frame, and it produced around a couple hundred horsepower. There were some reports that it even made a little bit more horsepower than that in the concept car, but 200 horsepower back in the day was quite a bit. And while the Starfire concept car wouldn't immediately be produced, the Corvette obviously was, it did start making its way into the model lineup for Oldsmobile. In particular, in 1954, the Starfire name was attached to the Olds 98 convertible. This was really Oldsmobile's halo car for that particular year, and it occupied a prestige territory along with other vehicles like the Cadillac Eldorado, the Buick Skylark. So it really was an expensive car. And that convertible ran for a number of model years. Interestingly, in 1957, Oldsmobile decided to call its entire 98 lineup the Starfire 98, whether that was a hardtop, a convertible. I'm not quite sure why Oldsmobile decided to do that, but perhaps they were trying to transition the name or bring some life to the 98. After 1957, though, the Starfire name kind of went into the history books for a brief period of time before re-emerging in 1961. Now, unfortunately, the Starfire that was introduced in 1961 and the concept behind the Starfire would only last through the 1966 model year before it would be put out to pasture yet again. It would be revived on a Monza-style compact car that was produced on GM's H-body platform from 1975 to 1980. That would be shared with the Monza, as I mentioned, the Buick Skyhawk, the Pontiac Sunbird. I don't really consider that a real Starfire necessarily, although it wasn't a bad-looking car. It just wasn't what the Starfire was supposed to be, which was an upper, let's say, end Oldsmobile, the top Oldsmobile, a flagship. Really something that was competing with cars that were in that personal luxury marketplace. And remember, that personal luxury car field was really something that was pioneered by Ford and the Thunderbird when the Thunderbird was transitioned to a 4-passenger vehicle in 1958 to huge success. So General Motors was trying to capitalize on the success that the Thunderbird had, and that's one of the reasons why the Starfire would become a new flagship for Oldsmobile in 1961, and also the reason behind a number of other introductions from General Motors like the 1963 Riviera. Regardless, for 1961, the Starfire debuted as its own model and a standalone model, and the first time that could be said for the Starfire. It had a lot of interesting features. First of all, the 1961 Starfire was only available as a full-size convertible. There was no coupe, there was no sedan. You could only get the Starfire in convertible form. And it had a lot of interesting things, including a high-performance 394 cubic inch V8 underhood, which we'll talk a little bit more about in a second, but also unique exterior trim, leather bucket seats, center console, tachometer, and other features that were befitting of a top-of-the-line vehicle from Oldsmobile. Now, in 1962, Oldsmobile would add a hardtop coupe to the lineup, and that was just because Oldsmobile recognized that many buyers were looking for something other than a convertible. Not everybody wanted a convertible, particularly in cold weather markets. So the Starfire hardtop coupe was introduced for 1962, and that nearly doubled the sales of the Starfire over the previous year. It still offered a leather interior, a center console, power steering, power brakes, and a powerful engine under hood. But what we're going to talk about today is the 1963 Starfire that you see here. Now, the 1963 Starfire in this picture is finished in a color called Antique Rose, and that's probably a very appropriate color for the styling, at least the name is, because I have to say, by 1963, some of the Starfire's features from a styling perspective were starting to look quite dated. You have to remember that this car was participating in the marketplace at the time when the 1963 Pontiac Grand Prix came out. It's extremely sleek and very minimalist design. Also, the Buick Riviera was introduced for 1963 that I previously mentioned. And you have the Bullet Bird, the Ford Thunderbird, that was really a purpose-built space-age style sculpture for 1963. So you've got the old Starfire, and as we walk around the car, you're going to see it's got some anachronistic or dated details that kind of harken back to the Harley Earl era, and perhaps that's one of the reasons why this car never really sold quite as well as an example, the Pontiac counterpart that outsold it 3-1. But up front, we have some themes that carried over from the 1962 model year, more specifically the frame within a frame styling up front that was introduced for that 1962 model year. And you see it here yet again, where you have this crease that runs kind of along the fender, makes a 90-degree turn, continues on with the bumper, and then goes over to the other side across the hood. Of course, that crease kind of fades out a little bit as it gets midway through the hood. But that is replicated to some degree in the styling of the grille and the bright work that trims the grille. Now, you also have, I guess Oldsmobile was pioneering Dodge-style grills back at this time, this crossed-hatch grill with the kind of egg crate-like pattern behind it, the full-width grill accentuating the width of the overall vehicle. And you have these little peaks on each of the fenders that are going to be replicated to some degree in the rear of the design. So some of these themes are similar to the previous model year. Some of them you're also going to see continue on to the rear of the car. But overall, as we start to take a look at it, I think you're going to see the styling of this just looks a little bit dated compared to some of the other competitors from the time. Now, as we continue to this front three-quarter view, this is really where that kind of throwback styling comes to fruition in terms of what you can see here. And I really would say that for 1963, the personal luxury styling was divided into two camps. Cars that kind of went all out with bright work and chrome trim and spears and tail fins and various elements of gorp and schlorp. And then at the opposite end of the spectrum was the minimalist school of design with relatively crisp and sculpted sheet metal, crisp roof lines, and overall restraint from a trim perspective. And looked at this way, really only the Thunderbird, but to a much greater extent, the Starfire fall in that category of piling on the bright work and having these different features that really were throwbacks by this point. And at the opposite end of the spectrum, the Grand Prix and the Riviera really went with that minimalist, crisp styling and not really adorning the vehicles with a bunch of doodadery. And here you can see that bright work on the side, the huge moldings that are covering a good fraction of the car. And I mean, it does look pretty good. It just looks a little bit dated by this point to have that bright work that runs the full length of the vehicle and accentuates the entire body side. And not only do you have the moldings and that brushed aluminum side spear that really is the signature of the Starfire and was in 1961 as well, that full-length flank panel that has that brushed aluminum inset into it. But you also have, you can see the peaked rear quarter panels that are trimmed with stainless atop of them that begins behind the rear quarter glass. Something that was still being used a little bit. The 1961 Continental had the bright work trimming the quarter panel as well as the fenders. Here, this is just on the rear quarter panels, but something that you often found kind of on the less modern vehicles or the personal luxury coupes of the era. And of course, you can see those, I'll call them demi-fins, at the rear of the car, a throwback to the 1950s and maybe even to that 1948 Cadillac. Oldsmobile, after all, was really starting to lean into some of that vertical signature out rear theme, beginning with the 1963-98 and the 1963 Starfire that took some Cadillac cues to the Oldsmobile lineup. And as we look at this side view, there's a couple other features that are noteworthy for the Starfire. You have these super toothpicky A-pillars. Of course, there's no B-pillar. This is a hard top. Still have the vent window panes. But then you have this super fat, chunky C-pillar. And the rising, I would say, belt line on this car kind of gives a little bit of a gentle wedge direction, at least from the door rearward. Nobody would call this a wedge car, but at least you have that rising line that gives some sense of motion, and the front of the car really doesn't have that sense of motion. You can see the front is very flat. It's not really leaning forward to any degree, unlike some of the other cars of the era. This one has a pretty flat front end, and the gesture comes from having that rising belt line that continues on through the rear quarter panels. And as I mentioned, this starts becoming trimmed with bright work under the rear quarter glass. The wheel arches are relatively simple and not overly sculpted, but they're there, and they are prominent in a kind of muted fashion. I think they look quite tasteful. Now, as we go to the rear of the vehicle, you can see the concave backlight. That would also be a feature on the 1963 Grand Prix, and something that would come into styling vogue in the not-too-distant future after 1963 and would proliferate its way through various vehicles, particularly the Chevrolet coupes in the late 1960s and continuing on through the 1970s. So the Starfire did have that as an interesting piece of, I would say, an interesting feature of the overall car. You can see from this angle, though, that C-pillar and the way that the drip molding kind of wraps around the rear quarter glass and then how the rear quarter glass is formed, at least to me, that portion of the car resembles a little bit of a 1963 Dodge Dart. I don't know that that's a great thing to say about it, but it does have some similar resemblance, at least in my eyes. Now, you also do see the so-called crucifix taillights, and that crosshatch pattern that was so prominent up front in the grille is here replicated in the rear. the top of the quarter panel intersecting this horizontal line in the middle of the taillight with a little reflector in the middle, a circular reflector. And you get a similar logo on the deck lid. So some of the features here are, I think, quite unique and handsome for the time. That concave backlight, as I mentioned, was something that was shared with the Grand Prix. So they had to give this a much different look to it. And certainly the Starfire has a much different look from the Grand Prix, front, rear, no matter how you look at it, even though it has that kind of shared backlight, the Grand Prix having those stacked quad headlamps up front. Obviously, this still having the horizontal quad headlamps, as we saw before. The Grand Prix having a crisp and formal roofline and a lack of fins. Just a much more modern look and a clean look, I would say, and an unadorned look to the body sides versus the Starfire. And as we go to the rear of the vehicle, you can see those crucifix-style tail lamps, the bright work, very heavy bright work. You have the bumper, and then you have this piece of bright work in between the taillights as well, just underneath the deck lid. So it's so much bright work on this car, particularly for a Bill Mitchell vehicle. Kind of surprising to me, but maybe that was because Oldsmobile designers thought that their clientele was younger. Pontiac, by this point, was really starting to bring in a more youthful buyer, and perhaps that's why Pontiac designers went in a more modern direction with their Grand Prix versus what you saw here on the Starfire. Now, as we turn to the interior, this is one area where the Starfire really did shine. Although I have to say the interiors on the Grand Prix and the Thunderbird and the Riviera, I think they're better too. I mean, they're absolutely beautiful, each of these cars. This was arguably the peak personal luxury car time frame in terms of just the interiors of vehicles and the styling and how much money automakers were putting into the cars. This interior is so finely detailed. You can see that beautiful center console that actually is a tack that's in front of the gear shift. And I don't know how you're supposed to read it or to keep your eye on it while you're driving. You got to clearly take your eye off the road to glance at the tack. But this wasn't the first car to do that. Fords and Chryslers would also put the tack way down there in the console for whatever reason. But the car did come standard with leather seats. That would be a standard feature on Starfires all the way up till the 1966 model year when vinyl would become standard in the vehicles. So you got real leather, you got the full-length center console, and the console-mounted tachometer, an electric clock, and various courtesy lights. And you also got this kind of upside-down horseshoe-like theme to the dash with the bright work, where you can see that dipping down, the bright work dipping down in front of the crash pad area of the dash on the passenger side. Beautiful pedal trim, too. Beautiful steering wheel with the recessed hub. Of course, this was before the collapsible steering columns, but designers were starting to think of safety and making sure that the mid portion of the steering wheel wouldn't impale you in the event of a crash. Here's a picture of the bucket seats, and you can see the full-length center console that I was mentioning before. One thing I will notice, take a look at where the power window switches are located. They're located on the center console. They're not located on the doors. So that saved a little bit of money. I don't know that that was designers' intentions, but I'm guessing that had to be a little bit quirky for buyers of the era, although power windows were a luxury and not found in many vehicles, so maybe I'm making more of a deal out of it than perhaps I should. Here's a better look at that console, the power window switches, the tachometer in the front, and then the gear selector, which you can see says PNDSLR. Yes, reverse is at the end of the shift quadrant. This is before the shift quadrants were standardized into the typical Perndl or Perndisel, if you will. The transmission, unfortunately, in this Starfire is the Roto-Hydromatic from Oldsmobile that was introduced in the 1961 model year and would be discontinued shortly after this Starfire was produced. It is not a very reliable transmission. Some brochures called it a 4-speed. It's kind of a 3-speed with a variable pitch stator and very clunky 1-to-2 shift. It's the transmission, not only when it executes the 1-to-2 shift is it shifting, but it's also locking up the fluid coupling and making it more of a direct drive in second gear. So you have the effect of the shift plus a lockup, and both of those combined really drop the engine RPMs, and it's a funky transmission. It's not my favorite. So Something else that I don't necessarily like about these cars, unfortunately, the Grand Prix would share that transmission. The short wheelbase Pontiacs were forced to use it. The long wheelbase Pontiacs like the Bonneville did not have it, but that's one unfortunate piece. If you're going to buy one of these cars, make sure the transmission actually shifts decently. Now, under hood in your 1963 Starfire, you found the Starfire V8, this highest horsepower engine for Oldsmobiles for 1963. It was a 394 cubic inch rocket V8, making 345 horsepower, which compared quite favorably versus the other personal luxury vehicles of the era, like the Riviera, where you could get a 425 cubic inch V8 was the top option that made 340 horsepower. Standard was the 401 cubic inch V8 nailhead. And that variant made 325 horsepower. So the Starfire did have a little bit more power than the Riviera of the same year. The Pontiac Grand Prix, you could get a 421 cubic inch V8 optional. It had a standard 389 cubic inch V8. The Thunderbird had a 390 FE V8. So the Starfire was pretty peppy. It's just unfortunate that you had to get it with that roto-hydromatic or Slim Jim transmission. You had to get that in the Grand Prix as well, as I mentioned. The Riviera used a variant of the Dynaflow. And then the Thunderbird had the MX Cruise-O-Matic, which was a good transmission, 3-speed automatic. So the Starfire and the Grand Prix really had to suffer with that poor transmission. And it's a shame, because otherwise the powertrain is quite bulletproof, but that transmission is definitively the weak link. So what do you think about the 1963 Starfire and its styling? And am I being a little bit too harsh on the styling? I think that it actually is a good-looking car. It's just one where the styling appears dated compared to the Grand Prix that came out, the Riviera, and even the Bulletbird that came out a few years before 1963 and 1961. I think that Bulletbird is a beautiful-looking car. So put a comment in the comment section and let me know what you think. But for Oldsmobile lovers out there, I have to say, if a great 1963 Starfire came up in nice condition, yeah, I would definitely be tempted. It's a cool car and a quirky one and super rare these days. Thanks again for watching.